Thank you all very much for coming, and I think I'll now turn the baton over to Mark, and he'll introduce our guest speaker. Thanks.
I'm Mark Warrack, and Diane just mentioned that we're going to be looking forward, but before we look forward, we're actually going to look behind and back a little bit to our heritage, and that's what the topic is about this evening, heritage conservation, in particular this part of the city, our neighborhood. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Madeleine McDowell, this evening. Madeleine's interest in heritage goes back many, many years. It started out as a small child. She used to canoe up the Humber River with her parents and through the marshes. And that not only gave her an interest and an appreciation for cultural heritage, but also natural heritage. And I'm sure Madeleine will be speaking about that this evening as well. In 1984, Madeleine's mother became the chair of the Humber Heritage Committee, and that is a position that Madeleine eventually moved into herself. And the committee was an umbrella organization of the Humber River, different heritage organizations in the area, to have the Humber River nominated as a National Heritage River, which eventually did happen in 1999. So you can see that took 15 years, and that's not unusual for that type of process. So talking about sticking with it, Madeleine certainly did, and I know in her family as well. Madeleine's passion of the Humber River and having it become a National Heritage River, she continues to be the co-chair of the Humber Heritage Committee and the Humber Watershed Alliance, so protecting the natural and cultural heritage of the Humber River. She's been involved in many heritage organizations. She's been an executive member of Heritage York, and she helped save the Lambton House and is still very much involved in Lambton House. And she can tell you about that if you don't know what Lambton House is. I'm sure you'd be glad to tell everyone. But of course they all know about Lambton House. That's a given. She also continues to be involved with the Swansea Historical Society and the West Toronto Junction Historical Society, both organizations. Madeleine also conducts walks for Heritage Toronto, and we have some brochures here. These are free walks that Heritage Toronto does from May through to October through all parts of the city, but Madeleine does do some of them here in this particular area. So I'll leave these over here, and please help yourself to one on the way out. Madeleine's also been on the Etobicoke Preservation Panel for the City of Toronto for a number of years, and continues to be on the Preservation Panel, and we can tell you a little bit about that later. But also, in addition to heritage, Madeleine's not just about heritage. She has many interests and has been involved for many years in things such as helping. She was the founder of a women's crisis center a number of years ago, and was also on was a school trustee for 14 years, and also interest in early childhood education and the arts, and was a member of the Toronto City Hall Arts Advisory Committee. So Madeleine comes with a lot of experience to us this evening. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to Madeleine McDowell.
I don't know whether I'm going to give you exactly what is expected, but it will be different. One of the projects that I've been involved in over the last 3 years has been an inventory of heritage bridges on the Humber River with the Conservation Authority and the Humber Alliance. And one of the bridges is the Bloor Street Viaduct. Now, when you say the Bloor Street Viaduct, everybody thinks the Prince Edward Viaduct. There is no other big bridge on Bloor Street. Well, they missed this one. It has no records in the Toronto Annals. You go to the city archives, nothing. It has, for 2 years of research, it's been the black hole. And I finally, through a little two-liner in a history of York Township a couple of weeks ago, and something from someone else up in Caledon, got an article in the Toronto Star about the about a worker being injured on building the bridge, and then on a worker who lived on Humberside Avenue and worked for Dominion Birch and Foundry. And so that established who built the bridge, the company. And from that, we were able to trace it back and discover that it was a provincial and York County bridge, not a City of Toronto bridge at all. And I found some minutes in City of Toronto council minutes that refer to it, and I will read a little bit from that eventually. I'm focusing mainly on Bloor Street and the surrounds. Keele is the 4th concession, and Jane Street the 5th concession from Yonge Street. Bloor is the name of the second side road. People refer to Queen Street and Bloor Street and St. Clair and that as concessions. Traditionally, they were side roads, and it is the second side road north of the lake. It's named after Joseph Bloor, who in 1830 was a Yorkville brewer and entrepreneur. Dundas is the highway laid out by Simcoe's men in 1793. By 1812, it was the second most important road in the province and remained that until fairly recently. West Toronto grew up along it and extended from Keele Street to Runnymede, later to Jane. Its southern boundary was Bloor Street and the border of the almost village of Swansea. 1909 saw the amalgamation of the cities of West Toronto and Toronto. But by then, West Toronto had passed a local option bylaw, making the area dry. They did that in 1903, and it persisted. This was part of the dry area, and that dry aspect was a very important one in the evolution of the area culturally and politically. It was one of the last bastions of dry in Ontario. Now, empty is the primary characteristic of space. And some people see empty as something to be filled. Think about that. It's not necessarily so. There's a lot of very beautiful space that makes life livable. In 1815, James or Jacques Babby acquired an estate west of Jane Street, between Jane and the Humber River. And in 1836, the engineer and architect John Howard acquired an estate on Bloor Street, between Bloor and the lake, which he named High Park, and which in 1873 he presented to the City of Toronto as a public park. It had a very substantial spatial influence on this area, and as a site of natural heritage because of the trees and the meadows. By this time, the Kennedy and Keele estates were established to the north of Bloor Street. And Mayor George J. Saint-Leger built his home, Glanboy, on Gothic Avenue, which later became a hospital and is now restored as condos. It's a designated building, kind of spectacular, overlooking the park and ravine. As Toronto expanded west to Jane, York Township and Etobicoke also became urbanized. In 1910, Robert Holmes Smith acquired a lot of property in Swansea and the Babby estate and some property in Etobicoke, which he proceeded to develop as the Humber Valley surveys. It didn't all take place rapidly because the First World War happened in there, and that put a hold on a lot of things. Following the First World War, Bloor Street and Danforth Road were developed by the province as Highway Number 5. That was to have a tremendous impact on this area because we had Dundas Street, we had the highway along Dundas, and the retail development and industry in the Junction, and some industry in the south end of Swansea. But with the development of Bloor Street as a major highway, which it remained until Toronto's final amalgamation in 1998, it caused Toronto to do a lot of thinking about the development along Bloor Street as well. And one of the things they did was put in a streetcar line right across town. This route opened on August the 25th, 1925, out to Bloor and Jane. And retail and trade along it developed similarly to along Dundas Street. So this area, which is traditionally known as Runnymede, was in between the Dundas retail and development and the slightly more recent Bloor Street retail and development. The Dundas West Strip in the 1950s and into as late as the early 1960s was the most successful retail strip in the entire city of Toronto. Now, this is a quote from J.C. Boylan's History of York Township. This was the little piece that I found on Bloor Street Bridge. Reference was made to, now this is with regard to the opening of the Dundas Bridge across the river in 1929. Reference was made to the Bloor Street high-level bridge built 5 years earlier and the benefit to the township of such crossings in the Humber Valley. 5 years before, the route of Bloor Street from Jane Street to the Humber had been changed by the township to connect with the new bridge. In other words, Bloor Street used to go straight across at Jane, and they gave it that little swoop south to connect up with the new high-level bridge. Now, into that you have to keep in mind that Holmes Smith had acquired all that property, and he owned down to where the new Bloor Street was. York Township thereby created a new street in which high-class apartments and retail business properties quickly developed. South Swansea and the Junction were industrial and good employment. Housing grew with much political support for real estate development. You should keep in mind that most of the mayors of West Toronto Junction were into real estate. Mr. Clendenin, well, there were two Clendenins, and there were stores scattered throughout the whole area in neighborhoods, little corner stores. There are very, very few of those left. There were ones along St. John's Road and along Annette Street, and along the side streets as well. There was one on Willard, at the second corner north of Annette Street. It was a little wooden store, 2 stories high, with curved millwork around the windows. They were large windows with stained glass in the top and a corner entrance, and a pot-bellied stove in the middle of the room that was the main store. I knew someone who lived there in the 1950s, but we were students together, and they still had the pot-bellied stove in the middle of the room. That building is still there. It has to be one of the very few wooden, it's covered with insul brick now, but it's one of the very few wooden stores, general stores left, certainly of an 1880s vintage. But there would have been a few like that through here. Bloor West is a mix of Runnymede and Swansea and York Township, and it grew up in temperance and women's suffrage, because the temperance movement was the only organization that supported votes for women unconditionally. And architecturally, the arts and crafts movement was in full force at that time, and it substantially influenced what was built here, with a dash of Art Deco. Now, the residential area developed retaining the immediate landscape with hills and slopes. When you go up Armadale from Bloor Street, one side's higher than the other. They leveled the road off, but they didn't alter the lots, and they didn't cut down trees. They left the remnant forest that was here. So we've got a lot of huge oak trees, particularly. The elms are gone. They were the victims of Dutch elm disease. These oak trees, particularly, are part of a gene pool that goes back a few thousand years. They didn't alter. We're talking around the First World War, and they didn't alter the landscape in part because some people still had wells, and you don't want to interfere with the groundwater, and they had the good sense not to do that. This is the Bloor Street Viaduct of which I was talking, only this was on October the 16th, 1954. So the Humber River goes completely across the whole valley. That was Hurricane Hazel. It was a big flood. I'll pass that around. Now, when York Township rerouted Bloor Street and gave new high-class apartments and businesses, this lovely little Art Deco, well, isn't that little Art Deco, is the Kingsway Pharmacy from 1936. And I mean, they had a pharmacy dispensary, but they also had a perfume counter and cosmetics and a candy and chocolate counter. We're not talking bag candy, we're talking very good quality chocolates and candy, and a soda fountain and bar where you could get sandwiches and that, and a beauty salon and dental and medical suites. And it's still there. Now this is Bloor and Jane in the early 1960s, taken from in front of the Odeon Humber. Lindsay Studios is visible across the road. Lindsay Studios was a very long-lasting and high-class interior design and furniture and gift shop. A lot of my mother's wedding presents came from there. Now, this is Bloor and Jane about 1940. It was a Lions gas station on the corner and a Bank of Toronto. That's the TD Bank that's on the corner of Bloor and Jane now. And it was well before the Odeon Theatre. That went up after the war. And this is same place looking the other way and showing the Loblaws store. This was the second location for a Loblaws store on Bloor Street. It shows the Lions gas station. You can tell that it was taken at the same time because this car is out front in both. Now, no, there are a lot of gas stations along Bloor Street. It was highway number 5. This was 401 through the city. Gas stations were important. This is Bloor and the South Kingsway in the 1930s looking east. And they were digging and restructuring the intersection. This is the South Kingsway looking north, about 1923. This little piece in here is the old Beltline Railway. It was all sand. They dug a lot of sand out, filled in part of the South Kingsway, and raised Bloor Street, 1923. They were raising Bloor Street. York Township was restructuring Bloor Street to curve out to where the new bridge was going to be. It's one of the few areas where they did make substantial alterations in the landscape. Now, this is the McCall Frontenac service station at Bloor and Willard, again on the Bloor-Danforth Highway. And the gas stations were quite interesting. Here, they're working on the Bloor streetcar loop in the 1930s at Jane, and it shows the previous Loblaw store, not that newer one that you're passing around. This one preceded that. It was on the north side of Bloor Street, opposite the streetcar loop. So it was one of the first incursions of chain stores into the village. Like Starbucks now. Now, Bloor Street went up and down. There were ravines that went across Bloor Street. When you go across on the subway, you know how the subway pops out of the ground. Oh, that's going through stream valleys. And when they put Bloor Street through as a highway, they and added streetcars, you had to have a grade level for the streetcars. You couldn't go up and down hills. And they were also putting in sewers and water mains. And for that, again, you want fairly level. So, what they did at Clendenin and Bloor was build trestles, wooden trestles. And on top of the trestles, they laid the sewers. And after the sewers were laid atop the trestles, they covered the trestles. They filled it all in. And then they added more on top of that to bring it up to the road height above, which is another 20 feet higher than the trestles. The use of wooden trestles and burying them was an old railway technique. The railroads used to build wooden bridges, and they discovered that the wooden bridges got a little shaky pretty quickly, and the wood would rot and it would fall down, and they'd have injuries, and it was not good. So they buried them, and the only part of the railway bridge that wasn't trestled was the bridge across between the what looks like hills. This is the Kennedy estate looking north. It's a little east of Runnymede Road. It's named Lakeview. Up in the corner here, you can see Western Tech. And the house in the middle was the Kennedy house. They had streams and 3 trout ponds that flowed off down towards Hyde Park. It was quite the place.
And does it still exist?
The house is still there. It's changed quite a bit, but you would still recognize it. Now, as well as gas stations, at Bloor and Kennedy, this building is still there, and it, we believe, was originally a Studebaker dealership. There was a Studebaker dealership on Bay Street that was almost identical. Now, this is Bloor and Runnymede, 1924. And this building on the corner that is the bank is the McDonald's that is there now. They tore the bank down and rebuilt it the McDonald's that is very similar. And the rest of it, this is still there. I think Starbucks is about there. And this is the men laying the streetcar track. This is the Runnymede Theatre when it was still a theatre. It was after it had been subdivided into 2 theatres. I remember it when it was 1, and there was a marquee out front too. I did not bring a little piece of terrazzo with me that I picked up on the street 2 weeks ago. When the City Works Department or the subcontractors or whoever was redoing the sidewalk out front, they took it up with jackhammers. And they didn't think that terrazzo from 1928 was all that important. So they're now having to fix it. I hope it costs them an arm and a leg. No, was it 1928 terrazzo? I can't believe that they could be so silly. Anyways, that was what it was like before it was chapters, and the ceiling inside. I remember after going to see a movie with my parents, sitting back in my chair and watching the clouds and stars up above. Oh, that was wonderful. Ellis was a local, mainly a Swansea, but Junction architect. He had a reputation and built things outside of this area as well, all over Toronto and other parts of the province.
Okay.
And Ellis Avenue is named after him. He did a little bit of entrepreneurial development as well. And this is the Ellis apartments that were built about 1925. This is a photograph of them from 1984. And they're a quite lovely example of the high-class apartments that York Township was so proud, excepting they were in the city, so York didn't get anything out of it. Now, remember I said about the house up on Gothic that became, and it became a hospital and is now condos. And below that, on the north side of Bloor Street overlooking Hyde Park, was a swimming pool when I was a kid, called the Mineral Baths. Everybody called it Minis, short for the Mineral Baths. But it really was a mineral bath. It started off as a mineral bath attached to the hospital, and it was used, the mineral baths were used for treating people with tuberculosis. It was supposed to be beneficial to them. And until, I don't know how recently, but certainly into the 50s, they had an outdoor school in Hyde Park for kids who had breathing difficulty. It was more for post-polio kids in latter years, but it started out with tuberculin kids. This is the mineral baths. And this little fountain in the middle is spraying out mineral water. And the nurses up at the top were responsible for looking after the patients as well as the others that were in the pool. And of course, one of the major adjuncts, one of the 2 major adjuncts to this area in terms of space and light and good quality of air and all that was Hyde Park there and the Humber River that way. And this is Hyde Park, I'm guessing at 1912 by the cars. It's around the beginning of World War I. And this is a map, or a portion of a map of Toronto.
Pretty cool.
From 1907. and I'll pass it around. You'll note the street names are a little different. I think Willard was Herbert, and Murray. Herbert Avenue took a jog, and there was Murray Street, and then Dury, and then Peel, and then Elizabeth. Elizabeth is Runnymede Road. That's out here. And Louisa was St. John's Road. Annette, according to Mrs. Bobby, Annette Street and Jane Street were named after two women who were good friends. The Annette was one of the Bobbies, and the Jane, she thought was Jane White. Jane was a concession road, and Annette was just being opened. The land was given on condition that the streets be named Jane and Annette, so that these two friends would meet forever. And I don't know how accurate that is, but Mrs. Bobby would have no reason to make something like that up, and I think it's absolutely charming. But that you can look at this and you know, it's large enough that I think you can read the names, and where we are is here, and you'll see Bloor Street goes straight and ends sharp at the Humber. It doesn't angle down as it does now. And of course, Jane Street ends at Bloor, but then there's Jane Avenue that swoops through Swansea and makes up part of Riverside Drive. This was before Holmes-Smith had acquired the property. The property that he acquired north of Bloor Street, the Bobby Estate, was sold to the federal government in 1909. The Garrison Common was attached to Fort York and the new fort, which was Stanley Barracks. That was where they did all their rifle training and that. And from the original Garrison Common, where they were shooting off muskets and rifles without a long range, to the rifles that they had developed by 1905. The bullets went too far, and there were people living on Dunn Avenue. Yeah, you get the picture. So they wanted a new location, so they bought a new Garrison Common. They bought the Bobby Estate between Jane and the Humber. And then they sort of realized that there's not that much land there. Maybe they needed something a little bigger, and they bought Long Branch, which was the munitions works and training and rifle ranges that was used up until the Korean War, at least. And they divested themselves quite quickly of the Bobby property, and Holmes-Smith was the acquisitor. According to the City of Toronto, this is minutes from 1923. Provincial highways construction, subway and bridges. The board begged to report that as the result of negotiations and conference with the Honourable F.C. Biggs, Minister of Public Works and Highways, Ontario, a mutual agreement has been reached respecting the width of certain works along the provincial roadway programs close to the limits of the city, which arrangement has been embodied in a communication by the Minister as follows. Biz. Confirming understanding at conference in my office this afternoon relative to a subway situated at the Canadian National Railway tracks on the extension of Danforth Avenue and bridges on Bloor Street at the crossing of the Humber and Yonge Street diversion at York Mills, forming part of the provincial roadway program at the Department of Public Highways. I beg to state that the Department of Public Highways agrees to build the aforesaid subway and bridges at a width of 60 feet in the clear, the respective width of roadway and sidewalks to be the option of the City of Toronto. The whole to form a part of the cost of the work to which the City of Toronto contributes 20%. 20 written in numbers as well. So, the rest of the Bloor Street Bridge came from other sources, mainly the province and the county. Now, this is from the Toronto Star, November 22nd, 1924, page 3. Page 3 is still pretty important. Bloor Bridge opens a western gateway. Formal ceremony marks another link in Great Bloor Danforth Highway. The rain, which came on in true chill November fashion late yesterday afternoon, did not prevent the gathering of a large crowd for the brief ceremony of the opening of the new Bloor Bridge, a Bloor Street Bridge across the Humber River. Darkness had fallen so that few of the crowd were enabled to see the structure as it looks from the new roadway. And had it not been for the lights of a throng of motor cars, the whole performance would have taken place in practically pitch darkness. The lighting arrangements for the new structure are not yet completed. Following a very short reference to the beauty and the great usefulness of the bridge, the Honourable George Henry, Minister of Highways, cut the cord which had been stretched across the end of the structure nearest Toronto and declared the bridge officially open for traffic. Before the ceremony began, there was considerable jockeying for place at the front of the double line of cars which were rivaling one another for the first place across the bridge. As he cut the cord, Mr. Henry announced, "I now declare this bridge open for traffic." And I think he leapt. Mr. Henry then, without comment or ceremony, unveiled the tablet which stated the name of the construction company, the records and names of the engineers who have been responsible for the work from time to time of the inception, together with the date of the opening to the public. Sounds wonderful, doesn't it? Newspaper tells you all that information is on the plaque. It ain't any place else, and the city doesn't have the plaque anymore. At least we haven't been able to find it anyplace else, and I'm assured that the city doesn't have the plaque. We haven't finished. The new bridge will not only be a source of very great convenience in removing a series of bad hills and dangerous curves from one of the chief gateways to the city on its western side, but serves to mark a further step towards the realization of the project of making Bloor Street and Danforth Avenue a continuous part of the great provincial route between Montreal and Windsor. This is the cool bit. Holmes Smith spoke briefly of the years in which he had dreamed of the developments. Yes. He felt at last that he had not paid taxes in vain for all those years. This is the guy that built and owned the old mill, and a few other, yes. David Spence, MP, and W.J. Guardhouse both predicted that the new structure would become one of the most popular highways in the city, which it did. And this is one of the engineering drawings from 1923. And the cool part is this is the drawing that shows the implantations isn't the right word. The places that they were going to place the posts for trolley wires, because the Bloor streetcar was not supposed to stop at Bloor and Jane. It was supposed to continue across the river. But it being the city of Toronto, TTC served to the city limits, and the city limits were the south side of Bloor at Jane. That was it. And the Dundas car ran to the back of the lots on the west side of Runnymede Road, north of Dundas, again, the city limits. And those of us who live further out, Duffy Wuffy. But I'll pass this around because it shows a small diagram of the bridge itself. I didn't bring the other drawings with me. There were 11 of them, and I didn't think that it was an overwhelming interest. Now, the streetcar was replaced by the Bloor subway to Kiel in 1966 and through Jane to Kipling in 1968. Retail on Bloor and Dundas took an absolute nosedive. From being really good shopping, it just went. Alex Ling and the other local merchants in 1970, or by 1970, fought back with the first business improvement area. This was the first business improvement area, not just in Toronto, in the world. This was a new concept of a partnership between business and municipality and the province. They believed that they had something that could trump a mall. The foundation of the Bloor West BIA is its local patronage. You guys, us. The destination patronage is cream. The combination of groceries, other retail, cafes, books, restaurants, this is what makes it a vibrant heart for the community. It is local business for local clientele and complements the residential. This is a great area to live in, but if we didn't have the local shopping. I run into people walking along Bloor Street, checking it out. They've moved into the lake shore or further north, and they have discovered Bloor Street. Oh, this is wonderful, and they're going to keep coming back. There's some superb public architecture in Bloor West Village. John Lyle's Runnymede Library for one, and the Runnymede Theatre for another. They're both designated. The Humber, that end, has reopened. Yes. And we've always had the Village Playhouse, of course. But landlords and real estate see fast money return. And all the hardware stores are gone. There isn't a hardware store in the area left. That's one of the things that you need in a community. You need a bank, you need a bakery, you need fruit and vegetables, you need meat, you need to be able to buy the day-to-day things like screws and hammers and what have you. So listen to the canary, because the vanishing of some of the businesses that are essential to a community could be a death knell, with absentee landlords particularly. But like I said, the Humber's reopened, so. The residential area developed retaining, I talked about the immediate landscape. Okay, well, that's more or less it. I didn't talk about the housing here because you people all know about that. The streetscapes are wonderful. And I have a few of these. There's an historical park that has been created along the Humber, and it's not finished, but part of it is finished, and it's being launched on Saturday, starting down at the mouth of the river at the bridge and moving up into Swansea to the Rousseau site. And I only had a few of these, so you take the information if you can't all get one.
Just a question.
And it's, yes?
If there was one book that you were to recommend that provides a general history of this area, what might that be? Because clearly you've drawn all your knowledge from a variety of sources. I'm just wondering if there's one book.
There are a couple of publications by West Toronto Junction Historical Society, and one by the Toronto Public Library. It's a history of Annette Street Library, and goes into a lot more than the Net Street Library. And I'm kind of biased about that one because I impersonate the first librarian there periodically from about 100 years ago. Kathleen Lazar's in the Valley of the Humber. It's 1913. She was Holmesmith's aunt. Most of the illustrations in her book were also used in Holmesmith's sales pitch on the Humber development. Go to Book City on Bloor Street, and in there they've got a whole section on local history. Some of it's very local, some of it's Ontario, and just sort of look through it. They're good bits. Ron Brown's done some interesting stuff. I've acquired my knowledge and understanding from the fact that my dad was brought up on Dury Street. He told me, dear, in the winter of 1918-19, I remember the lumbermen going through and taking out some of the oak trees. Now they cut down the oak trees where the roads were going to go, but they didn't cut down the trees where the sidewalks were going to go, and they took out the oak trees where the houses were going to go. And the rest they kept. And that was through this whole area. And so I've got that sort of an information source too, and I know other people like that. Anyways, if you have any questions.
You've mentioned a number of the interesting buildings of architecture in the area. I just wondered how many of them are designated or come under some kind of protection.
Not a lot. There's the Runnymede Theatre, whose terrazzo obviously is not protected since the City Works Department doesn't talk with anybody else and know what the heck they're doing. The Runnymede Library. We're looking at a number of others on the preservation panel. We're looking at trying to put together a collection of buildings by individual architects who did a lot of work in the area. But it's very slow happening. Preservation services don't like to move on things.
I know I looked at the inventory today for all of our ward, and there was only a handful of buildings that were actually designated. I know some of the churches on Annette have been designated.
Yeah.
And the house that you were mentioning on Gothic, which is now a multi-family unit, that was original, the hospital, and that's designated. But there's really only about 4 or 5 in our, and in the whole ward, and in our particular area, only like maybe 2, 3. It's not much. And some individual houses that really stand out, and you think, oh, that's a heritage house, that's got to be protected. It's not. None of the schools. I mean, we have some beautiful schools, gorgeous schools in this area, very unique. None of them are protected.
You guys can go after that.
Yeah.
The school board will not be cooperative, I can assure you.
I know that.
York Memorial Collegiate was designated. I was a school trustee at the time. I was the only person on the board that supported it. And I couldn't open my yacht because my mother was chair of the LACAC. And it would be perceived as a conflict, which it wasn't in any way, but I couldn't say anything. But it got designated. Council said, up yours to the school board, and designated it.
Good. But there aren't very many protected.
No. They haven't been able to get Jarvis Collegiate designated, which boggles my mind.
Yeah.
They've been trying.
So that leads to the question is, what, if anything, can the residents association or, people in this particular area as a community, what can we do to help designate, to help protect?
Well, there are heritage districts, heritage conservation districts, if you want to go that route. And you could get involved with the West Toronto Junction on that, because this area, I think I got this area set aside as Runnymede, but I'm not sure whether it was included with with the West Toronto because of the old boundaries of the city of West Toronto prior to amalgamation of the city. If you have any buildings or sites that you think are really important, you can come to the Local Conservation Advisory Committee and we can talk about it. A site can be designated for architectural value or for contextual value or for association with a person or event, or a combination of those.
So what about something like Parkside Drive, which I really enjoy driving past all the houses along there, and it's mostly intact with only a few egregious alterations.
Again, that,
I don't know whether that would really come under your designation.
I think our order is
I know.
Parkside Drive.
Yes, well, it's not that it's necessarily in
Yeah,
this grouping, but it's close by. I mean, I just gave it as an example.
yeah. Well, the Junction is trying to get a heritage conservation district together, and they're looking at High Park.
I mean,
Because
that's bordering
it's-
apart.
Well, no, like High Park Avenue.
Yeah.
North
Um,
Humber.
Yeah, yes, I know that one.
And you know, it's slowly coming together. They got galvanized because they almost lost a house. And they're slowly working at it. The rules that you have to go through entail hiring a professional consultant, which costs a lot of money. You can get some money from Section 37, Section 4, okay, Section 37 and Section 45. Yes, I discovered Section 45. Section 45 may pay for some lights on the Old Mill Bridge. Section 37 money can be made available to the community for funding for heritage district study. But we're talking a lot of money. It used to be,
Do people know what a Section 37 is? Does that mean anything to anybody? I had a feeling they may not know.
oh, okay, okay.
When there's a development which is getting higher density and greater density in what they're allowed, like let's say this church was to be removed and in this spot they were going to be putting up a 20-story condo when you're only allowed to have maybe 2 stories. Because the city would allow them to do that and they're getting extra bonusing for the building, that's called a Section 37. So in lieu of doing that as their special
It's
favor.
compensation blood money.
Yeah, it is. It's compensation blood money. And so that money goes back into the community and it can be used for a number of different things. It's usually for community development such as parks and maybe streetscapes and that sort of thing. But they only recently, it was only about 2 or 3 years ago,
And
the
the bond
city,
got them talked to.
yeah, the city allowed that money can also be used to do heritage conservation district studies and put that together. Yes.
Well, I'm very concerned at the moment between Pacific and Oakmount on the north side of Bloor. There's some very good properties that are right now letting to rot. They will be demolished. I don't know how historical they are, but they're certainly very much in sync with the neighborhood. And I believe it's a shame that this will be demolished to build out of.
It is a shame, but you're right, they are being demolished and there is going to be development put in there. And out of that will be Section 37 money.
Yeah.
The development will probably exceed the bylaw height between the Parkside and Jane, will it be?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Is there anything we can do about that?
I think that development's already set.
it's
It
done.
just puts you in mind that there's other areas along the park that you're potential.
I know Babby Point is also in the process of looking at being a heritage conservation district.
Oh, they've got a website and they're galvanized.
So I don't know how far they're along.
They're, the city won't talk to them at this point.
But I mean, it's a natural area to be.
If Scott will say, then they can get on with it. They're prepared to go for bridge financing, take out a loan.
Yeah. I mean, it's a real natural, because it's a very defined area. It's perfect as a heritage conservation
But
district.
streets like High Park Boulevard or High Park Avenue or Parkside Drive are pretty obvious.
Well,
You
again,
don't have to be an expert
the
to
city is just going
realize
through,
they're
the
important.
city hasn't adopted the policy, but they're looking at a policy which has not been adopted yet, but it has gone once through council, that if an area or a community such as ours wants to have a heritage conservation district, that the community must pay for it. First of all, they have to pay for it, and secondly, you have to prove you've got the money to do it before the city will even consider looking at your application.
And that's what Section 37
Yeah.
thing is all
What is it
about.
that the money goes to?
The money goes to the study, because it is an expensive process. You have to investigate and do title searches on every property. You have to look at the history of every property, when, how they were built. And then you also then look at what are you actually trying to conserve and protect, and then you have to put in guidelines and a plan how that will be protected over time, and what kind of new development you will allow, and how that's done. And they can be very, very detailed and time consuming. I'd say the average Heritage Conservation District plan probably takes anywhere from 2 to 5 years to put it together. And that's consultants and staff working on that all the time. So it is a very expensive process.
And what are some of the examples in Toronto right now of a district preservation area? Would Cabbage Town be one?
Yes, Cabbage Town is actually made up of, I think, 4 Heritage Conservation Districts that they've amalgamated into one large one.
And where, any others? that-
Weston has Heritage Conservation District. Rosedale is the largest in Ontario. They have actually 2, South Rosedale and North Rosedale. I think that between them there's something about 1,500 properties.
It's one on Beverly, isn't it?
I'm not sure, but there are about 25, I believe, in Toronto at the
Yeah, it's on
moment.
Harvard.
And there are 49 in the province pending at the moment, on hold. There are 103 across the entire province of Ontario. So you can see they're not all that common, and partially because of the cost.
Yeah, and also, part of the cost is because you have to be able to defend it in court.
Yeah, well, they do, it is a
And-
requirement that
and
it
there
must
was-
go to the OMB.
And there was the one that, down in Welland, that was lost.
Yeah, they do have to go to the OMB, and the OMB can change the conditions of the plan
And
before it's
what
adopted.
restrictions, just on home, so if an area was to be designated as a heritage district, are there limitations on what a property owner or a homeowner can do to his or her property? I think is that perhaps an obstacle in the minds of some people, that there are.
Yes, but every plan is completely different, and really the community decides what is their plan and what do they want to impose on an individual property. The purpose of a heritage conservation district really is to look at the area and what's important about the area. So you look at the streetscape, you look at the trees, you look at things like roads and pattern of roads. It's not about individual buildings, unless there are certain buildings that really stand out, such as the churches, the schools. There might be individual residential buildings that are large, and open spaces are extremely important.
Yes, and when the buildings have to be contiguous, has to be one after the other, right down a whole block or however much of a block. But they can be valued that, you know, this one is really, really important, this one is really, really important, this one is, If somebody wants to do something with it and come up with something that will go with the rest of it,
Yeah.
that's okay.
Yeah, it's about compatibility, so that if something comes down, whatever goes up is similar in shape and form, not necessarily style, but shape and
Yeah.
form, so that it's not standing out.
Like the Heinzman house,
Materials.
the 2 Heinzman houses on High Park Avenue, they are like pain of death to alter them. But some of the others are less, there are a couple of 1950s duplexes that if somebody wanted to tear those down and put something else there that fitted with what was already there, that would be okay. And generally, property values in a heritage conservation district go up.
And the reason they go up is because you're creating a very stable neighborhood, that you know some weird thing isn't going to happen next door. Because there are some, if you want to call them controls,
Yeah.
careful review
Yeah.
put in place that doesn't allow for something bizarre to happen to an individual property, that it must go through a process to make sure it is compatible and that it does fit. So often those properties in a district, as Madeleine said, are more. Joe?
If I could interject a little bit, I can provide my perspective on the cultural heritage plan. Unfortunately, I'm not from Toronto, I'm from Hamilton, so my opinion is somewhat neutral. Yeah, in 2005, there were significant changes to the Heritage Act that changed it from designating buildings to properties, and that very much broadened the scope of designation. But at the same time, for districts, it allowed for a class of changes to be exempted from consideration of the designation as a district. So it's kind of a bit of a balance between the zoning, city zoning, that sort of stuff allows very broad brush controls over development. But as we've seen with something like Babby Point, a monster home can be legal within the consideration of zoning. What designation as a district can do is provide more in the way of micromanagement. But as people who want to create a district potentially, you can identify where to draw the line in terms of changes. There was a beautiful website maybe 5 or 10 years ago called purplepillars.com. Some guy, I can't remember, in Kingston or thereabouts in Eastern Ontario, who was dead set against designation. But as soon as he found out that he could paint the pillars of his home in purple, he realized the controls were not that great, and so he became a fan of designation, just because he wasn't aware that the degree of micromanagement wasn't necessarily that high. With the caveat that in Oakville, they do have some pretty tight controls, and they will tell you what color they want you to paint your home. Being a cultural heritage planner in Hamilton, we don't care. So it's a matter of what the staff feel like, and also the wording of these district studies, and critically the plans for the districts. So sorry to go on.
I know some districts do dictate color and materials, but it's
Yeah.
extremely rare. You don't
Yeah.
find it very often.
And again,
or it's a very small district that's really very particular, like a time frame. Maybe all the housing stock is from like 1850 to 1870, so
Yeah.
they want to really control it. And that's, I think, legit to do that.
But again, that's largely a result of what the interests of the residents
Right.
want as priorities, and because they are the ones that have to drive the designation. For example, in Hamilton, we don't look at designation unless 66 to 75% of residents want to designate and are fairly actively going to participate in that.
But there is no magic number.
But
There is no
magic number.
there is
It's
no
just
number at all.
for us.
Actually, it's up to community, and it becomes a political decision whether or not they move ahead.
Yeah, but again, bear in mind that the folks in the city, like me, have to understand that there's some popular sentiment within that wants to support designation.
Because otherwise, it's not going to work.
Yeah.
It has to be supported by the community.
Yeah, I mean, technically, if I can talk a bit of legalese, there's a court case, Lakeshore, down in southwestern Ontario. There's a Part 4 designation saying that, they basically said that a city council, if it chose to make the principal criterion for designation as being willingness of the owner, the council is in conflict with the law. So designation does not have to be done with the permission of the owner or owners of the properties being designated. It has to be considered, but it's not an exclusive factor. So, hostile designations can take place if the resources are sufficient.
Yes.
Not that we would urge that.
Yeah. Steve?
Well, what would you say if people in this area were to want to embrace the whole notion? What would be the features of the Bloor West Village area that would be considered unique to it and protectable, if I can put it that way?
I think first of all you'd have to break it up into small little pieces. That as an area, it's just way too big. You'd have to break it up into small pieces. And I think the thing that I find probably the most unique around here, and Madeleine did talk about it, is the topography. Because you go to any new subdivision, it's completely flat. They just bulldoze it, fill it all in, make it flat, and then build the houses. We have an incredible topography in this neighborhood. And some of those which are so striking, like around Clendenin and some of those other little streets in that area, that you really can appreciate the topography. It wasn't destroyed. those, I think, make up some of the most interesting cultural and streetscapes that we have in the area. But I think you'd have to look at it at a smaller version.
Are you talking about groupings of 20 buildings?
It could be blocks.
Yeah.
Yeah, usually, it's usually done as city blocks, but it can be really anything. It's what you feel is significant and what means something to you as a community.
What would you say is the minimum price tag for getting something?
Again, it really depends on how large an area. If you're looking at all of Bloor West Village, then you're looking at probably thousands of dollars. I mean,
Many
hundreds of thousands of dollars. Because I know I was involved in one, because I'm also a heritage planner. I was involved in one that was 100 homes. So that's not huge. It was about 4 blocks by 4 blocks. And that was 160,000 to do that. And it took 3 years of my life. Day and night for 3 years.
So Steve, Gothic
Is that a rule
Avenue,
of thumb?
Gothic Avenue would be $1,600 per house.
And I talked to one of my colleagues up in Brampton, and they were actually they already had a heritage conservation district that was done 20 years ago. They wanted to revisit it and look at how it was done and reconfigure their plan and strengthen their plan. So they did that, but even doing that for a relatively small area of about 50 homes cost them $100,000 to do that.
And this is raised all out of the homeowner's pocket?
That's what the city of Toronto is saying.
That's a lot of big things.
Yeah.
That's why they're not happening now.
We're really very, very concerned about.
However, the city has not passed that policy
Not
yet,
yet.
so there is time. And that's something maybe resident association could do, is to express their opinion on that.
The heritage is nice, I appreciate it, but I do speculate sometimes, like, as technology changes and everything, 100 years from now, what will the houses or the accommodation look like in this neighborhood? I mean, let's say brick homes of a certain shape and all that, was a certain kind of roof, was the style, the thing to do in the early 1900s, and maybe some other, like, we're seeing a lot of these big square things coming out now, and I don't know if there's a name for that style, what it is, but.
It's more a modernist style, but I think
Yeah.
that's
And I don't know if it makes better use of space, or what it, like maybe it has some.
it's style.
Yeah, what concerns me is that as things change, so much of it is just done not tastefully. I mean, it can be done, things can change. I don't mind that it
Yeah.
potentially could change, but.
And
so
that's
much
what a
of it is
heritage
just
conservation district is for, is
Yeah.
to allow change, but in a way that is compatible for the greater good and design and the stylistic, and looking at materials, everything for an area.
I've heard that we're relatively protected in Bloor West Village because the houses sort of fill the lot, like they're already a good size, so it's not like down in Swansea where you have a little one and you're gonna raise it.
There are exceptions, but generally, yes, most of the lots are relatively small.
There is an absolutely delightful little house in the corner of Weatherall and Armadale. And the architect that built it for himself. The woman that lives there now, her parents bought the house.
That's
So it's-
Betty, right?
Yeah.
Yes, I love that house.
I want to designate, we talked with her about designating it, and she's all of a sudden, no. And I don't want to
I
upset her.
would love to see that designated. Our house is so fantastic.
People think, oh, if I designate my house, I can't sell it. Well, that's not true. I mean, Joe can tell you that,
she's
she's a heritage planner, so am I, that is not the case.
The architect was the one who did the work for the pressed iron company. And the eaves troughs and downspouts there are original pressed iron.
Wow.
And the interior of the house is well preserved too. I mean, it's just absolutely
Because it's a bungalow,
drop dead.
someone's gonna buy it.
It's tiny, it'll be a decent
Probably.
And I'm
Would be a
very
shame.
concerned.
Yes,
If there was some community will to
Yes.
do that,
Yeah.
it could maybe be acted upon.
yes, back.
I think, so, when you're walking down Rundy, down this way towards the Bloor, there's a house on the right that has like a stone fence in front of it, and it's a stone house. Like, I just wondered what that was originally. Was it a farmhouse or? because I go by and I look at it.
Is that the one, it's a Montessori?
No, it's,
No.
you know it if you, it's
okay.
actually made of stone.
I can sort of picture the stone wall.
Yeah, it's a stone wall, but the house is made out of similar stone.
Oh, yes,
not
it's,
brick.
oh, yes, I
And it's
know
set
that.
back
Yes,
further?
it's a story and a half.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
I
lovely.
also, I was just wondering, is that the Kennedy home then that's right over at Kennedy and Colback there? Up on the hill. Sort of up on the hill?
It's up on the hill, but a little ways down the block. About 2 doors down the block. I can locate it when I walk there. No, I've got to actually physically go there to locate it.
You go down Colback to Runnymede, make a right turn on Kennedy, and it's right there up. It's now all, it's all, the brick has all been painted.
Yeah, I think that's, like I said, I have to physically be there to say that's it, but I think that's,
Does that house have pillars?
Yeah, that's the house with the pillars.
It's just before Runnymede Public. On the east side.
There are a number of listed properties in the area, but not
Yeah.
designated.
Yeah.
And there is listed well, the city holds what's called a register, an inventory of heritage properties. And being listed on the register or the inventory means that not much other than should the owner apply for demolition, then they must give notice to the city 60 days prior to the demolition taking place.
and the city
And that's-
can move to designate.
Yes, and then that 60 days, that gives the city an opportunity, if the will is there, to actually designate and prevent the demolition.
Which is what we did with the Baptist church.
Yeah, so a listing does help, and so there are a number of listed properties, but as far as designated, there are very few. And even designation does not mean it won't be demolished, but it's a pretty good chance. Under the Act, in order to have a building that is designated demolished, it must go to the OMB, and the OMB decides. And that's not a good thing, but that's a whole other topic.
But there are so many buildings and sites that are of importance that are not listed or anything
Or
else.
designated, yes.
And we would like to have, not a list. I haven't come up with a word for it other than a method of, a list of.
A wish list.
A wish list, an address of, a list of addresses with a little bit of information about them, flagging them so that the works department and the planning department and the building department will be aware of this as an important site. And if there's a query comes about it, then something.
But ideally, all of those
reacted.
really should be on the city's inventory register, so that they
I
are.
would wonder if that's something
formally
that people
flagged.
who are retired might be able to do some research on properties and.
That would be absolutely wonderful. Anybody who's retired who wants to help. Yeah.
When I
Let's do some.
retire?
When you retire.
Evelyn?
Why is the city passing the responsibility of ownership for residents as it relates to those financial?
Well, part of it's financial. They don't want to spend the money, and there are a lot of requests. They have requests, I'd say there's probably at least 25 to 30 requests across Toronto for Heritage Conservation Districts, so that's a lot of money. And the city's saying, we can't afford it. If you want it, you pay for it.
So there's no will there to protect.
Not when it comes to the money. And staff time, they are very understaffed. The Heritage Preservation Services is extremely understaffed in the city of Toronto.
Can you explain why the cost is as high as it is? Like, where does the money go to when a house is designated?
Well, not an individual house, that's different matter. That is not a costly venture, and that can be done. I shouldn't say relatively easily, but in theory, relatively easily.
Yeah, the theory is
There are, first of all, you have to meet the criteria for designation for an individual property, and that's criteria under the Ontario Heritage Act. It's called Regulation 906, and there are 9 points broken down into, as Madeleine mentioned, 3 areas. It can be for its physical design, its historical associative value, or its contextual value, or a combination of all 3. So it has to meet at least one of those criteria to be designated. All the research has to be done on the property, when it was built, who lived there, blah, 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 all of that. And then once all that's done, they do a report that goes from the preservation panel to the preservation board, then that goes on to council. So it's somewhat a lengthy process and can take anywhere from several months to several years, depending on the property. And it's nice if the owner is in favor, because then they're working with you and you're not looking at that battle. But council can designate without the owner's permission, but if the owner is still set against it, then the owner can say, no, I don't accept that, even though council is designated, and within 30 days of the designation, they can appeal it, and it goes to what's called the Conservation Review Board. And the Conservation Review Board is a tribunal set up by the Ontario government, which looks at designation, but it does not make a final decision. It only makes a recommendation back to council, and council has the final say on whether or not the designation proceeds. Is that too much information?
Can somebody other than the owner get a house listed?
Oh, certainly. It does not have to be the owner. It can be anyone in the community. It can either, for both listing and designation, can be anyone in the community put that forward. It does not have to be the owner.
It would seem to be advisable to make a good case for the benefits of being listed or whatever before you approach the owner.
Yeah.
Well, I with this particular owner, I had already talked with her, and she was all in favor of it, and then she just.
Somebody said something.
Mm-hmm.
She's still out weeding her garden, though. She's still, I've seen her quite frequently. Maybe a casual chat with her will.
I think she's getting fragile, wants to be sure she'll have money if she needs it.
Probably, yeah.
But it wouldn't
No, I know.
interfere with that.
No, but people don't understand that or don't accept it.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like we have a lot of interest in this topic, and I want to really thank Mark for taking the leadership here in organizing this meeting and having such a wonderful guest speaker. So if there are people who really want to pursue this a little further, I think that's something that we can do. And if a small group of people want to come together and start to do a little bit of the research or the thinking, we know there's pieces of work going on in the Junction as well, so maybe we can learn a bit from them. So if there are people who want to come forward, and we'd be really happy to work with you. So, and I want to thank Mark because he knows a tremendous amount, and I'm not a burden on him, but he would be probably a good shepherd for helping us make some good decisions here. So I want to thank you all very much for coming out this evening.
Just want to thank Madeleine McDowell.
Yeah.
Please, the City of Toronto doesn't believe it, but you can do it.
Yes, you can.
Well, also our counselor is open to new things as well. I mean, I was just at a meeting with her, Dennis and I, last week, and she's interested in also doing some cleanup in the area on where all the postering is. If you all have this dislike of seeing posters being plastered all over city poles and other places, she's looking at having more designated areas in the ward for where information can be posted. So she wants us to start to think a little bit about that, and the BIA probably as well, because they're doing that whole change and beautification down on Bloor Street. So it's a good time for us to do something where there's a central location for information.
Then I'll only take a second, but I just wanted to explain that, because that's a good point, Madeleine, about trees. Because when you designate, you don't designate a building or a structure, you designate the property. It's the actual real estate. So you designate the real estate and any significant features that are on that property. So it could be a tree,
Yes.
it could be a building, it could be a combination of the building and the tree, or whatever else is there. It could be a fence, like that. You mentioned the house down here that has the stone fence. That could be designated so that it's always there. So it's you can think of all of those things, not just buildings and structures. It's all things related to heritage.
Great, thanks for that. Okay, well, thank you all for coming out on such a warm evening, and thanks for general.
You can leave the bottles behind, we'll collect them to recycle them, or if you haven't finished them, then you're welcome to take them.
So have a great summer, and you'll hear from us in the fall.